Hello, my name is Major Nick Narbatovsky, and I am here to talk to you today a little bit about design. Up till now in the program, you have been focused mostly in the realm of the human. Who am I? How do I lead myself? And then how do I build a team and lead that team? This week, we are going to be launching an investigation into how you create that which is needed but does not yet exist. This basic definition of design is pretty broad. And the umbrella term can create a little bit of confusion if you're looking for very specific terminology. However, design has many different disciplines. There is industrial design, which is focused on creating things quickly and efficiently and mostly focused around processes. There's human-centered design, which focuses around the experience of the people going through either the experience itself or using a product. And there's also a relatively new discipline called military design, which is focused on understanding the environmental frame in order to answer questions about complex and sometimes just complicated military problems. Of these three basic types, military design is often the most difficult to wrap your mind around. So we're going to start off in the human-centered design area. General Brown, in his Accelerate Change or Lose document, talked about focusing on coming up with new and different ideas and enhancing our partnership with industry. So you may be thinking to yourself, this human-centered design thing, from what I've read, seems very focused on an industry side. But not to worry, it has application in the military realm as well. One thing that the military organizations and the civilian sector have in common is people. All of our organizations are made up of people. We are always solving human problems. So a lot of the focus on leadership is going to be about solving those human problems. So in this course, you're going to learn to take a four-frame analysis to look at the different aspects of a human-centered problem. Now, this human-centered problem is directly related to mission accomplishment. If you don't have the people focused and working together, then you're not going to be able to accomplish your mission. During this use of human-centered design, you're going to be going through a lot of exercises that are going to hopefully get you into a different frame of mind. Instead of jumping right into what is the solution and then working towards it, you're going to spend some more time in the problem space, really understanding what the problem is, thinking about it in different ways, which is going to allow you to come up with many different solutions that you may not have thought of otherwise. Now, at the end of this week, you're going to present your design product. This design product may make some of you uncomfortable. It's not going to be a concrete set of orders, and it probably isn't going to be even very specific on what should be done. But instead, it's going to be some sort of product that allows the recipient to think about the problem a different way and is going to be the first step on the journey of solving this problem. After this week, however, you're going to be stepping directly into the study of joint warfare and military and warfare specific problems. Now, the one thing that is most important in the field of military design is the environment. Everything happens within context. So, understanding that environment and understanding that context is vital to making sure that you are solving the right problem. There's nothing worse than spending a lot of time and energy solving a problem only to find out that that wasn't actually the problem that needed solving in order to get where you needed to go. One tool that may help you figure out what the right problem to solve is in a military design context is something called scenario planning. Scenario planning is a pretty powerful tool that came out of a company called Shell in the 80s. This was mostly focused on trying to figure out what the future held. And so a lot of it is going to be focused on trying to predict the future. Now, you may be asking yourself, how could I possibly predict the future? And you're right, you can't with certainty. The future is complex. And in this case, I'm using complex very specifically. Complexity means that the actions that you take in a system will not necessarily result in the same results every time. So, for example, take your thermostat system in your house. It may be pretty complicated. There may be a lot of different widgets going here and there, and you may have to set things a little bit differently depending on the environmental conditions to get the result you want. But ultimately, there's a concrete set of rules, and if you do a certain action, you can expect the same result every time. A complex system is one in which you can't really expect that same result every single time, 100% of the time. So the example here would be the movements of a crowd. You can usually say you think that a crowd is going to do a certain thing based on environmental context. However, that crowd may do something completely different. And all you're left with is a probability that that thing might happen the way you think it's going to happen. So keep that in mind as we dive into the concept of scenario planning. For scenario planning, the thing you're going to need to do is first identify two base tensions that exist in the future that you care about. Now, these tensions can take the traditional form of time or money, but you could also get really inventive with it, like will to go to war or peer competitor capability relative to us. So really think and dive into what things that you care about that are going to affect you and your organization and have an answer to the problem that you're trying to solve. The next step is going to be to draw a very basic quad chart on a piece of paper. This quad chart is going to have four areas. In the top left is going to be E1 and then clockwise, E2, E3, and E4. These four different areas are going to be four different possible futures that you are examining. Along one line, the horizontal axis, let's put budget. We'll say this is the amount of money that my organization can expect to get at some point in the future. Let's say 10 years. On the other side is going to be something a lot more broad. Let's say the will to go to war. So on the top, you would write a very high will to go to war, and then this is in reference to the people. And at the bottom, you would write low. So on the left, we have a low budget, and on the right, we have a high budget. On the top, we have a high will to go to war, and on the bottom, we have a low will to go to war. Now, when you combine these different areas in that frame, E1, 2, 3, or 4, you're going to get a very different potential future in each one. Let's take E1 for example. There's a relatively low amount of money available to my organization and to my military unit, and there's a relatively high willingness to go to war. So as you can see, this presents a problem. We're pretty low funded and not very ready, but there's a high likelihood that we're going to be asked to act. Let's go the other way. There's a very high will to go to war in E2 and a very high amount of money and budget. So we're probably very ready to go to war and we're very likely to be used. So this is potentially a very high ops tempo future. Now you can see how these start to play out and how eventually you're going to have four different possible futures that you've examined. Now these futures all represent environments that you're going to be operating in. So you would use your four frames that you learn in human-centered design and analysis to look at those different areas. What is the political context there? What is the human context, etc. Now, as you may have noticed, we haven't actually started to answer the question, whatever the problem is, at all yet. All we're doing is simply empathizing with possible futures. After you've completed this task, you're going to have a difficult question to answer, and that is which of these environments are you going to analyze and use to answer your question? Now, you could take the most likely environment, or you could take the most dangerous environment, or you could pick somewhere in between. But odds are one of these four different areas that you have identified is going to be relatively simple and doesn't require a whole lot of planning. So this environment you might call the Goldilocks environment. For our example here, I would argue that E3 would be our Goldilocks environment. We have a whole lot of money, we're probably very ready to go to war, but there's really not a whole lot of will to use us. So we're probably going to sit around and go to exercises and not do a whole lot operationally. Now keep in mind, these are only two tensions. As you're probably aware, there's a lot more than just two tensions at play in any given future. So, if you would like, you can add additional tensions to this. But keep in mind, for every additional tension that you choose to examine in scenario planning, it's going to be a base 2 increase in the number of futures. So if I have two tensions, I have four futures. But if I add another tension in there, now I have eight possible futures that I have to consider. As you can tell, this is going to get pretty complicated pretty quickly. So once you've figured out which future you want to plan to and which future you want to start answering questions in, now you can start to figure out what your planning and design relationship is going to look like. Now, design is very different from planning. Traditional Western thought hinges around looking at the future that you want to occur and then figuring out how you are going to act in order to bring that future about. What things can you do to bend the universe to your will to make the thing that you want to have happen actually occur? This is pretty contrary to most of the design attitude because it's focused more around the idea of Eastern thought, where you predict this possible future, you figure out what it might be like, and then you answer the question of how should I best act or how can I best operate in this future? Now, despite the seemingly antithetical views here between military planning, Western thought, and this Eastern thought and design, there actually is a symbiotic relationship between these two things. However, this relationship hinges around a concept called the planning horizon. Think of the planning horizon as that point in time where you can predict that something will probably happen to a level of certainty that you're comfortable with acting on. Now, that sounds pretty fuzzy, so let's unpack that for a second. Let's take the case of the raid on Osama bin Laden, for example. Now, when President Obama ordered the raid, there was about a 50-50 chance that bin Laden was actually at the compound. However, that 50-50 chance was the point where he decided that he was comfortable acting. You may need a 70% probability before you can move to action, depending on what you're doing and what the consequences of the action are. A lot of this is going to rest on command discretion. You or your commander may have a certain comfort level that you need to hit before you're willing to act. However, some people may be comfortable operating at a much lower level of certainty. Either way, that probability that a thing is going to happen and that you're willing to take on and act on is going to define your planning horizon. Now, your planning horizon happens at a certain point in the future from where you care about. Let's take this vertical line as the present, and we'll take two very different scenarios. Let's say budget cycles and then turning in an aircraft when you're fighting another aircraft. For a budget cycle, things are pretty predictable, and I can tell with a high degree of certainty what my budget's going to be for the next 5 years because of the Palm cycle. So while it's not absolutely guaranteed, my planning horizon is probably going to be something on the order of about 5 years. I can plan to have the same amount of money in my budget every year for the next 5 years. However, if I'm in an aircraft and I'm thinking about turning and trying to shoot down another aircraft, I don't know which way that other aircraft is going to turn at all, really, until I see it actually move. Now, this planning horizon might be as simple as 3 or 4 seconds in the future, but it's no less important to know when you're thinking about the possibilities and when you have to actually act. When we're doing deliberate design and using this planning horizon concept, we also want to make sure that we're not ignoring things that are outside of the most likely scenarios, but could have disproportionate effects. For example, there may be a line of possible futures out there that coalesces into probability, but its probability is relatively low. On this diagram, the further away from the center a line is, the less likely it is to happen. These events that are relatively low probability but relatively high impact are referred to as black swan events. An example of a black swan event might be something like a global pandemic. Relatively low probability of happening at any given point, but has a disproportionately high impact on our operations. And so we still need to plan for it, even though we think it's relatively unlikely to occur. So now that we understand the basic concept of design, how to approach design, and how to use our scenario planning, and we understand that there is a planning horizon where we have to move from design product into planning, how does that actually play out in practice? Well, first of all, you will probably have a design sponsor. This could be you if you're conducting your own design inquiry, or it could be your commander if you're answering a question that they have. Ultimately, somebody has to be in charge of this effort. This person will ask a question or give a prompt to a design team. The design team will go through their process and they will figure out what they need and they will produce some sort of design product. This could be a statement, it could be a very detailed description of something, it could be a metaphor. Designers love metaphors. So once that is produced, the design sponsor then takes that and gives it to the planning cell. And the planning cell is responsible for taking that design product and running it through the planning process. The most common planning process that you will run into in the military is the joint planning process. It's codified very clearly in Joint Pub 5. And Chapter 5 is probably the best, meatiest portion of that if you want the nuts and bolts of it. But the joint planning process is a very clear and very specific codified set of events that is designed to produce one thing, and that is orders. And so now you see the process from initial design inquiry, design team, design product, planning process to orders. This is how design leads to changes in the world. Now, this is a lot of information, so let's do a quick recap. Now, remember, design is creating that which is needed but does not yet exist. We talked about many different disciplines of design. Industrial design, military design, and human-centered design being just 3 examples. We are teaching you human-centered design in this course because of the fact that we all run into human-centered problems in our organizations, and most likely, as captains, you're going to be able to put those skills into use immediately. As you broaden your design experience, you're going to be able to take those skills of four-frame analysis, human-centered design, and then build them into using things like scenario planning to answer complex and complicated military questions in the field of military design. We can use scenario planning to envision possible futures, then we can ask questions and answer them within those futures. From there, we create a design product that, based on our planning horizon, will move from the design team over to the planning team and eventually will create orders. Thank you for your time and listening to this presentation, and I hope you have a great time the next week learning human-centered design and really getting into the nuts and bolts of how do you solve difficult and complicated problems. General Brown and the rest of the senior leaders recognize that we need a significant change in the Air Force. This is codified in the National Defense Strategy, as well as the Accelerate Change or Lose document published by our most recent CSAF. Please take the skills you're about to learn seriously, and always remember to ask as many questions as you can.